in the iterative process of engaging with stakeholders was something we had embraced early on. So if you're interested, I'll tell you at the end a little bit about the survey and the supply chain. So we're going to focus here for now. Lose my connection.
No.
Uh-oh. Okay.
You just need to click on the screen.
Right. There we go. So what do we do in this analysis of biophysical capacity? I'm not going to show you a model diagram right now. That wouldn't be helpful. We essentially did three things. I'm going to talk through the methods and the results together. First piece was estimating livestock performance for this grass finish system. We don't, it's not like we have an existing system to base it off of, at least not a very large one. And what are the feed requirements of them? Piece number two is figuring out what's the area of available and suitable agricultural land. And piece three is understanding the productivity of that land for forage, both raised forages and harvested forages. Okay, that's what we did. And spoiler alert, what we found, at least for parts B and C, the area and productivity, is that there is a lot of uncertainty, which I'll get into. That's what makes it so interesting. So let's begin with the livestock piece. And for anyone in the audience who's not familiar with beef, here's a quick primer on how the system's organized. So, and this comes from some earlier work on feed conversions, ration compositions, and land use efficiencies of livestock, major livestock products in the US. And I've taken the diagram from that work. So if you start with a cow, and I have one bull, there would usually be, there'd be more cows than bulls. We'll get to that in a minute. That's the core of your reproductive system. Cows have not usually one whole birth per year, a little less than that. They produce calves, and some of those calves are saved as replacement animals. Now, on any individual operation, you might not be saving bull calves, because that's probably done by special operations that are really raising animals for progeny, as breed animals. But the heifers would be kept on cow-calf operations. They're replacing the animals that get culled every so often from the breeding. And this circle here is essentially your stock of animals that are producing the market animals. And the market animals are going through three different phases in the US. The first phase is shown here on the left, the cow-calf phase. Some will go into this stopper or backgrounding phase where they're fed a forage-heavy diet and it's either raised or delivered to them as forage. Then they're going into a feed market, and then they're going to market. The difference with the grass finishing system, of course, is that rather than having this feedlot phase, it would be a finishing phase on grass. But otherwise, very similar structure. To understand the feed needs, you need to know what are the relative proportions of these animals to one another. And there's deaths all over the place. Unintended deaths that happen before an animal goes to market. So the first part of this figuring out how much the animals need is characterizing the system. And that's what we've got here in this first table, which is showing our smallest unit. We modeled what Mike Baker called a bull unit. So it's 25 cows, one breeding bull. This is smaller than some cow-calf operations, but it's a functioning unit. And the other numbers here show you the basic production numbers. So weaning, they wean 90%, or I should say 90% of the cows wean a calf in this system, which means you've got 23 calves total, 11 steers go to finish, and 8 heifers go to finish. You have a replacement rate of 15% per year, so you keep 4 heifers for replacement. And those are the basic numbers in this herd. We look at calving at 2 different points in time. Most operations in the United States calve in the spring. We also look at calving in the fall, so that you have essentially a continuous stream of animals throughout the year. And these animals were getting finished at 20 months, which is older than a feedlot animal on grain would be finished. and they weigh about 500 pounds. You don't need to remember these numbers, although we'll come back to some of these later. But this gives you an idea of the size of the system. You can see you have to maintain 25 cows to get this output of 19 and finished animals. And as you'll see, this ends up having a big impact on feed. We estimated feed requirements for pre-weaned calves and then all other animals using two different approaches. So for the pre-weaned animals, there was a model used to estimate the needs of the calf, nursing calf and cow together. It's hard to distinguish their separate needs. And then for the fall-born calves, a dairy study was used because these animals are not on pasture. The other animals were estimated with a large ruminant nutrition system, which considers the breed, the climate, management system, feed composition. And all of that affects how much you need and what quality of forage. What we found, I won't talk too much about the total digestion nutrients. I'll talk about the dry matter, because we'll come back to these numbers later, is that to feed this breeding unit, you need about 190,000 kilograms of feed dry matter. So roughly 200,000. For the spring herd, it's a little more for the fall herd, but that's rough numbers. We're talking 200,000 kilograms. 2/3 of that roughly is going to the breeding herd. And then you've got 1/3 going to the finishers. And that shows you how much the breeding herd drives the feed need. And that would be true of conventional system too. The other thing it shows you is that here on the right, if you look at the difference between spring and fall, there's a slightly higher feed demand for fall because you're feeding animals for the winter. And there's a little higher basal metabolism requirements to keep them gaining at the same rate. Not widely different, but some. And if you want to wrap this all up in a number that might be easier to relate to, for feed conversion ratios, you can boil this down to one number. So our 190,000 kilograms of dry matter divided by 19 finished animals times their live weight equals 19.5 kilograms, pounds, grams, whatever mass unit you want to use of input, feed input to get 1 kilogram of live weight output. It's a little higher than the feed conversion for feedlot system, but it makes sense because they've got more grain, higher total digestible nutrients in those rations, and shorter times to finish. So we'll come back to these numbers later. You can think about this as almost 10,000 kilograms of live weight output in terms of that. All right, let's leave the feed needs for a while and come to land availability. And I want to distinguish here between two different ways of measuring this: land cover and land use. So if you're not familiar with the difference, land cover is characterizing what the surface of the earth looks like. So it could be something like forest, or it's covered by water, or it's covered by some sort of developed cover. Whereas land use is characterizing the purpose to which it's put. And while they're related, these things are distinct. Land cover is usually measured with remotely sensed data, satellites, or days of viewer, and still sometimes, I guess, satellite, or not satellite, but aerial photography. Whereas land use is going to be some survey or other instrument for getting information. They tell us different things. We have these two sources, and we'll start with the land cover to see what it tells us. So we looked at land cover specifically in hay and pasture, and I'll explain why in a moment. But I just wanted to show you, where is this land located in the region? A lot of it is in New York. And if you're not familiar with New York geography, here's Adirondack Park. There's very little there. It's relatively well distributed throughout the rest of the state, with the exception of Catskills down here. We have another concentration here in Champlain Valley, and then distributed throughout the rest of the region in patches. This is about 2 million hectares of land, 5 million acres of land. And why do we focus on these cover categories? Because we suspected, and Riggle showed to some extent, that this land is not competing as much with other types of food production. So how do we look at this? What we did was took multiple years of cropland data layer, which is now produced, for those of you who aren't familiar, produced every year by NAS. And what we did was look at the same points with a sampling of points over a 7-year period. How did it change? What were the different cover types over that time period? And to take this category here, the largest one, hay and pasture for all 7 years, that's about 1/3 of all of the land cover was in that category. And then this next chunk, hay and pasture for 6 years, was another big chunk. And this could be error. There's enough error in this data set that this actually could have been in pasture all 7 years. It was just error in the data. You could make an argument for that. But what we see is that there's also another fraction here, field crops for at least 4 or more years. And these are the annual field crops, mostly corn silage. So you see, it's not quite a complete split of the land. There's some land that is all categories in less than 4 years. There's clearly a rotation, but there is some specialization in the land base. So we continue to focus on the hay and pasture land for the rest of our project. Now, because the land cover data doesn't tell us the ownership of who's using that land, we compared it with data from the Census of Agriculture, which only looks at land that's on farms. So you can assume that it is land that is in production to some extent. We compared both hay and pasture separately as they're categorized by the census. That's what the map is down here. Compared to the cropland data layer here, and you can see it wasn't a great match. The one-to-one line shown here with the dotted line, the dark line is hay and forages, and CDL says there's more land in those land cover types than does the census. The census says there's more land in pasture than does CDL. So each wrong in a different way. We decided that it wasn't worth distinguishing between the two, so we made an aggregate category, and that's closer to the one-to-one line. But there's still this, essentially, what the land cover data says there's more land, perennial grassland, than does the census. By a large measure, you can see this regression coefficient there is 1.4, so that's a big difference between the two. We wanted to know, was this real? Because it could be, we've got 2 different methods. Is this just error introduced by the methods, or is it corroborate the story? We were able to corroborate. What we did, we went and compared 2 different land use data sets. The Census of Agriculture, which is what we saw on the previous slide, and another data source, the major land uses data, which are collected by, I should say compiled by Economic Research Service. And they take data from multiple federal, I think it's mostly federal, data collection projects and come up with a harmonized data source. That's meant to be wall to wall for the whole United States. And they use the same land use categories, which is handy. So here we've got just the agricultural. We've got cropland, whether it was harvested, failed, or abandoned. We've got cropland pasture, idle cropland, and permanent. Those are the key land use categories. And you can see, comparing the two, the difference column shows the difference between the census and the major land uses data. You can see the census has a little higher reporting of cropland and cropland pasture, and somewhat lower estimate of idle land. And you can imagine that some of this may be due to reporting differences. The census maybe is not capturing all the land that's idle, for example. But the big difference is here in permanent pasture. It's huge. The value shown in the major land uses data is almost 3 times what it is in the census. And that's probably mostly coming from the National Resource Inventory, which is going out and keeping track of land use change on 5-year intervals. On the whole, it means that for this agricultural land, we're talking about the major land use is saying there's essentially 700,000 1,000 hectares. That's a big difference. And it's not really well explained why they're different. Where is this extra land if it's not on farms? Who's using it? It could be access. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But that was the major finding of about land use. Now, yields presented another story that was only partially satisfying in terms of what we learned. We started with, well, we want to look at actual yields. And for actual yields for hay crops, we've got a great data source. We've got mass statistics going back to 1919, so 100 years of data. Whereas for estimating grazed yields, USDA would go out and ask farmers to estimate how much feed are their animals getting from pasture. It's simply not measured. So I will talk you through how we estimated this. But it was a guess to try to get an actual yield. We wanted to compare those to potential yields. The potential yield data we used comes from the soil survey. The soil survey data, well, we use this new data product called the Gridded Soil Survey Geographic Database, which is a digitized version of the old soil surveys in raster format. The data on expected yields aren't necessarily new. In fact, in talking with the state soil scientist in Massachusetts, he said, well, some of those data are probably decades old. So they're vintage data. And you can wonder, to what extent do we need to be concerned about that? But just flag it as something to think about. The reason we chose them is that they're available for most agricultural soil types. They give an estimate of what could you get with good and prudent management. So not necessarily the highest possible yield, but what is attainable. We thought that was a good reference and the best reference. So that's what we went. Now the historical yields show an interesting story. As I said, we're going back, it shows 1920, but the first data point is actually 1919. These are weighted average, weighted by the total amount of production for the region by taking the individual state data from the 7 states. We looked at alfalfa hay and all other types of hay. And what you see for the first 3/4 of this chart is very much like a chart if you looked at US yields of corn or US yields of wheat or US yields of soybean. This general march upward in yields, although maybe starting a little earlier than in food grain crops. And that trend, that upward trend stops about 1980 or the early 1980s. And depending on your interpretation, maybe it levels off for the hay, excluding alfalfa, maybe it's dropped for alfalfa hay. But it hasn't continued that upward trend. The reason we looked at this was we wanted to know what is the trajectory currently of yield and compare that to the potential. So as I look at this, if actual yields have been stagnating, bouncing around for the past 30 years, if we're using old yield data for potential, it's probably not as much of a concern. We may not have closed those gaps. Now, grazing yields were tricky. As I said, we had no data to work with that directly estimated. So what we did was took inventory data, which are available in the Census of Agriculture. They're available on a 5-year basis. And we counted the heads of all the grazing animals from the 7-state region. That was our starting point. So I'll talk you through our logic here in estimating grazing, which really should be called stocking. It's really a stocking test calculation. So we made some assumptions about how often we're eating that off pasture. So the inventory is shown here. I've done a little bit of aggregating of categories. The paper has the full detail. We've got dairy animals here, milk cows and heifers, beef cows, other heifers, steers, bulls, goats, sheep, horses, ponies, and all other grazing livestock, which is a grab bag of things like llamas, alpacas, and bison, and elk, and deer. The next line here is annual feed needs. And here, the data we got from dairy is different from the other categories. Let me talk about this. we leveraged some data that were collected as part of a nationwide life cycle assessment of the dairy industry. So credit to Greg Toma at the University of Arkansas for sharing portions of that data with us. They had done a representative survey. They wanted to get regional differences in the impact of dairy. And in that survey, they collected information on how much feed is coming in prison. This was gold for us because I assumed that most of the animals were in confinement and largely crop feed, given the way dairy is done, practiced these days on most farms. And what we saw from these data, these were data collected in the early 2010s, is that for cows and heifers on dairy operations, it's a very small percentage of feed that's coming from feed dry matter that's coming from grazing. Varies from farm to farm, but it's about 2% for the milking cows, a little higher for the heifers, but fairly low. For the other animals, we didn't have this type of data, but we assumed that many of them will be out on pasture for whatever grazing season is available. So we estimated their feed needs in animal units based on the definition of animal units, which 1,000-pound cow plus your calf is 1 animal for reference. And then we estimated how many months are they grazing, and we did leverage this data here to corroborate an assumption of 6 months. You could graze longer than that, but we're essentially saying there's potentially 6 months worth of fodder to graze. And it's from the definition of an animal unit times the number of months that we estimated the gigograms of dry matter needed by all these categories. For a grand total of basically about a teragram of dry matter required to feed all the animals. We divided this by the area of land that is on pasture on these farms and come up with an estimate of how much we think they're grazing. Huge number of assumptions, talked about at length with reviewers, but they eventually threw up their hands too. So, yeah, there's not much more you can do. So we put in 2 years of data to do this. So it's based on 2 Census of Agriculture years. Now, before I show you the take-home slide for yield, I want to show you the potential yield. What you see on the left-hand side here are the yields for soils that are reported in Sturgo. And you can see there's a lot of area here that's in white for where there's no data. Now, there is land that's in hay and pasture on some of the soils. So we did some modeling to essentially fill those data gaps. And at the price of shrinking some of the variability in the data, but we're coming up with a mean, we weren't too worried about that. In the color scheme here, pink to yellow are lower yields, purple to dark purple are higher yields. And you get the sense there are areas like the Lake Ontario Plain, Lake Champlain Valley that are high yielding in that area. So there's some variability. We use this to do essentially a yield gap analysis for the region. And what I'm showing here, I didn't even dare calculate errors because I thought the error bars would be misleading. I'm not sure that we're actually comparing apples and apples. So no error bars to avoid making interpretations of that kind. Light green is actual yields or our estimates of actual yields. Green is the potential yields. Units here are megagrams of dry matter, so metric tons of dry matter. And you can see big differences. This was not surprising to me. Even for the hay crops, even though these potential yield data are rather dated, there's a 3 megagram per hectare gap there. Not quite 50%. It's a big yield. And it's larger for our estimate of grazing yields, which 2.6 megagrams per hectare compared to an estimate of about 5.5. It's not even greater than 50%. What's magic about that number? Not much, but the literature on yield gaps suggests that it's possible to get usually within about 80% yield gap. So usually you don't close it entirely. I don't know that that would be the case here because we've got these older estimates of potential. Maybe you could close the whole yield gap shown here. But it's big. There's definitely room for increasing growth. All right. Let's try putting this all together. Because this is the challenge we faced towards the end of the project of, well, we looked deeply at feed, we looked deeply at land. I even Cheryl the data land, looked at yield. How do we draw it all together? Step one is looking at the potential forage production. This table is really meant to show how much of a range of variability there is in these estimates. We essentially looked at two scenarios of land cover, two scenarios of production. So one estimate, the lowest estimate based on current grass cover on farms and actual yields. And then combinations of either more land or higher yields and more land at higher. In terms of area, we're talking the difference between 1 million and 2 million hectares, between what's on farms and what appears to be grass cover but not on farms, plus what's on farms. Because of this range in yield potential, we see the different, basically a fourfold range in production potential from about 3 teragrams of dry matter to 12. That's a huge range. And these intermediate scenarios essentially being in the middle, maybe being able to double forage production just by focusing on yield, or likewise to roughly double it just focusing on increasing land. And where does the true potential lie? Nobody, it's anybody's guess, but this is our kind of setting the stakes of what it is and how you might achieve it. And that's without clearing any new land for agriculture, which was a starting assumption for the project. What does this mean to get to that final number of how many animals could you raise? Because that's what we were after. So same idea. We've got the forage yield levels and the grass forage available. And I have two different assumptions here. One is retaining forage for existing operations, which I'll talk about in a moment. Set these up as 2 4x4s. So there's one, assuming that we could use all the grass forage on these 1 or 2 million hectares for feeding grass finished animals. The other set assumes that, well, we got to retain forage for any animals that are already in region. That's the reason for the difference. Here's what we found. So if you look at the box at the top, I've got numbers out to 4 significant digits, and they're not significant. I'll come to that in a moment. But so focus on the relative magnitudes here. About 300,000 head to be finished at current yield levels on the land that's in farms. And if you expand the yields on the existing land, you can maybe double that. If you could expand the land and cover at the existing yields, you wouldn't quite double it, you could certainly increase it to almost twice. And you could almost quadruple it by fully closing the yield gaps and expanding onto the full yields. If you account for the forage on existing operations, which was done, you could say elegantly, you could say crudely, by assuming that this number here represents how many animals we could feed off the existing forage. If we subtract those from the other 3 boxes, we get our other estimates, which shows you could go anywhere from 0 if you have keep all the existing animals, no increase forage productivity or land area. And what could you do if you maximize the land area, build up that land and perennial cover, and completely close the yield? Almost 900,000. What does that mean? Well, first, let's take a moment to talk about numbers. Have you heard of the term anchoring and adjusting? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. If you haven't, I'll define it. The idea is that we tend to ground our perception of reality based on the first number we hear. And then we adjust to see, okay, what's a reasonable range around that number? Maybe we didn't get quite the right number. And the range you adjust would be, it might be more than one significant digit, but it's not any more than one. And I came across this idea thanks to a former graduate student of mine who wrote a paper on this. And it stuck with me because that you only get that first chance to make a good impression. That's exactly what's happening. So I've taken the estimate of the maximum capacity for animals at the number of digits I reported in the last table, 882,000, and consider different estimates. Consider we rounded it to 2 significant digits. Consider we rounded it to 1 significant. Consider we rounded it to the nearest million. And it begs this question, which I think is part of modeling in general, but maybe even more important when we're talking about an alternative system, is how to present the numbers without leaving people with an undue sense of precision. And if you said, well, if we used all the available land and increased productivity, we produced maybe about 1 million cattle. Turned out it was 800,000 or 1.2 million. People would still consider that probably in the same ballpark. This is far too precise. So that's a warning to take modeling results in general with a grain of salt, unless you have error bars on. And lastly, a little bit of interpretation of the findings. What does this mean for regional food production? What we said in the paper is you put this in the context of national food production. So New York and New England could effectively produce up to 2.5% of the nation's finished cattle. So 1 million would be about 2% of the nation's finished cattle. There's some other non-finished cattle. Rough numbers. On less than 1/2 of 1% of U.S. cropland and grazing. So what that conveys, it's not a large amount. It is large relative to the size of its land footprint. And if you consider that these 7 states have about 10% of the nation's population, maybe 2.5% of the national cattle supply is not a small number. If this was a product that was largely going to be marketed regionally anyway. So it's a way of trying to put it in context. Is the region going to produce all its own beef? Not according to this, but could it be substantial? Yeah, there's definitely room. So where do we go from here? Future directions. I think there's a lot of room to get better production data, which is not surprising. Better data, more precise data on yield, particularly for the grazing yields, particularly for on the hay side, probably also for potential yields and more recent estimates of that. There's a need to consider competing and complementary land uses, whether it's from people moving into the region who are buying rural residences that also have agricultural land attached to them, whether it's land for photovoltaics, whether renewable energy, or, name it. There's a lot of competing land uses, some of which can be complementary. One of those complementary land uses, which is of great interest to me, is this integrated dairy food systems. And had a few conversations about this. It's an area that the ARS unit might move into when we hire an animal scientist, but it's one that's definitely of interest because, just take Vermont as an example, roughly 250,000 dairy animals. If some of the calves off those operations are bred with partially with beef genetics, you have animals that could be raised for finishing, and without adding more of those animals in the reproductive herd. Related to that, mixed species grazing is a way of making more use of pasture ecosystems. And what's the potential there? And then a need for some more exploration of the cost of production, understanding economics of this. What's the price point at which you can bring it to market, as well as environmental metrics, particularly thinking about not only the greenhouse gas emissions being one, carbon capture, soils being another, so on. So I think it's an interesting enough story that there's lots of ways that could be done. And with that, if you're interested in some of the other published work, there's a couple of one extension bulletin and one research bulletin at Cornell on a case study of an actual supply chain in New York, information on the slaughter facility survey, This is the citation for the work I presented today. We have some work in press on the optimization model for the beef supply chain, and then another publication preparation. So it'll soon be wound up, and I'm looking for ways to continue to work. So thanks for listening, and it's time for questions.
I can do that part of
Thank you, that'd be great.
So rather than a question, maybe this is a comment. Perhaps some of the inefficiencies that your numbers are showing, and I recognize that it's different. It's difficult to get precise numbers because almost nobody measures dry matter intake or dry matter in hand, or dry matter supply. There are few farmers that do, but you can count with one hand. So I think there are a lot of inefficiencies that can be polished by adjusting some levers in the management of the pastures. That will increase, it will increase the amount of forage that animals can take, and also will increase the rate of efficiency of weight gain, so on and so forth, as well as simple tricks like following the rather than doing like frontal grazing, doing a sort of producing a chest effect in the field. The chest effect is when you place your animals where the pasture is ready, where the forages are ready, and it's optimal resting point for them to come in, and that increases efficiency almost sometimes twofold. I saw some numbers of 2,000 pounds to 2,000 kilos per hectare. We can easily go 30 or maybe 50 or sometimes 100% more than that when we do it like exactly. The problem, I think, one of the problems we have is that, well, there are many problems, but I think whoever deals with grazing feels that don't receive enough, for the work they do, and at the same time, most small farmers have a side job on the farm, so they practice these front grazing, strip grazing, which is not the most efficient. I've seen the best grazers here in the US, and I cannot tell one that considers I'm going to use a phrase from Spanish here, translated into English. The art of knowing how to jump pastures to produce the chest effect, so that you jump wherever the pasture is ready at its optimal resting point, so that you capture those inefficiencies and become more efficient grazing management. So there's no farmer here in the West that does that. I'm positive. If you correct that, you are adjusting some inefficiency. Another thing that I think that is affecting some of the efficiency is subsidies. Fortunately, we live in a rich nation here, and farmers can receive lots of subsidies. If you report back to New Zealand, mid-1980s, New Zealand had a policy that would end all subsidies. And from morning to night, they had to adapt to produce more grass. And they became the most productive, the most cost-effective countries producing animal protein, dairy, wool, or meat from grass. They learned how to do it. They produced technology that help farmers to excel on grass. And today they are the boss in terms of cost of production. So I think we need to keep pushing those things, and I love the future directions that talk about multi-species grazing and talk about beef and dairy, or combining synergies between beef and dairy, and so on and so forth. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. No, and agree completely with the comment about room to improve grazing efficiencies.
Yeah.
In fact, I would say that the estimates of the actual grazing yields could even be kind of high because of the assumptions about how much grazing is coming. For 6 months of grazing, that's assuming no supplementing with hay, and in reality that probably being supplemented some of the time.
And it's the challenges of, collecting these kind of items. Really.
It's a great room for more work.
Yeah.
For future.
Yeah, sort of in a similar vein, if I could have you go back to that alfalfa and forage yield slide.
Yeah.
So what do you?
Your screen.
I'm the administrative advisor or lead for the New England-based or Northeast-based multi-state hatch on forage and alfalfa breeding. And our proposal, and it started this way for 3 cycles before I was here or working, when I worked on wild medicago instead of alfalfa. Like there's not much support for grazing. There's some land grants have been cutting their forage breeders for 50 years. And there's very few left. There are people like me who are not really breeders. But I mean the Don Buy-in for a while was the last one in the Northeast, has been replaced by Jimmy Moore, who likely at Cornell. And that's about it in the Northeast. There's not, the public sector hasn't stepped up. Do you think that peak is the loss of, basically when public sector breeding stopped?
Gosh, I don't know. I should add to this too, that my major advisor, was a forage scientist, is retired now, Gary Fick. So he and I talked about these numbers a number of times, but I'm not sure what's happening. I can tell you part of what I've been into. So I was concerned that part of this, because these are hay yields, is that we also have some of this being measured as actually being harvested as forages and not dry hay,
Right.
which does contribute to it. But I compared the per acre yields of including silage in addition to the hay, and it brings it up some, but it doesn't show you, oh yeah, in fact there is still a trend. So it's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. I'm not sure about alfalfa. I do have another idea about the non-alfalfa hay, because at least in New York, there's a large number of acres of land that is in hay farms. So that's they're categorized under the North American industrial classification system as hay farms. And these aren't necessarily intensively managed operations. Maybe,
No, they're not.
Maybe a way of keeping land in agriculture, and that would pull down the average. So if you're doing 1 or 2 cuts of hay a year versus, it's going to dilute the average for the producers that are doing more intensive management. So I think that's part of the averages are masking that story of where the improvements are happening. Yeah. And then I don't know about the forage breeding, to what extent that plays into it. But I think there's probably a very rich story explaining why this is plateaued, because it's not the same for some other crops.
Is this data for dairy exclusively, or is it for?
This is all forages. So these would be hay, all hay yields in the 7 states. Now the alfalfa would probably be mostly dairy farms. I'm not sure how many growers are concentrating just on forage production, but with the grass hay, there is this whole other category of hay farms, which could be quite large in terms of area. Yeah, it counters the story. If you look at the graphs for like corn and go back to 1866, first data point, it's like bumps around 1930 starts to increase, then 1945 it's like a we're still on the ride.
Is that with the advent of synthetic nitrogen like being more available after?
Oh, there's a fantastic graphic. The ERS is not updated. It's old now. They had Corn yields across the 20th century, actual yields, and then they also looked at total factor productivity. And at different points measured, okay, when was the introduction of the first tractor? When was the introduction of hybrid seed? And when was it 10% adopted? When was it 90% adopted? And they did that for fertilizer. And they did it for herbicides. And it ends in the late 90s. So you don't see the biotech boom, but it's you see the story of, okay, one major innovation after another to boost yields and producing this.
And even alfalfa, maybe the most intensively bred, has almost none of those as a crop. Breeding alfalfa is still the dark ages. It's a tetrasomic polyploid self-incompatible perennial. You know this is the student of a forage scientist. Hybrid seeds are hard to generate. There's a brilliant Argentinian in Florida who's doing genomic selection in alfalfa now. See some major gains there. They'll trickle up here. The rest of the forages are any crops.
And there's so many.
So many.
Any questions on why?
I'm a little bit still interested about the, you showed about the discrepancy of the data in 64%. The current technology and remote sensing, I don't think this kind of discrepancy we should not see. My biggest.
That one.
Yeah. No, you should.
Oh,
you should.
This one?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah. Oh, I think I can explain the why here. I think this is a real discrepancy. It's because the sensitive agriculture is the survey population is only farms. Whereas major land uses data is also taking into account other data sources. So they're filling in the gaps for land that's not on farms. And that's why I think we have especially this discrepancy. And this is not satellite imagery. Both of these are based on surveys.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
People recording. Oh, my God.
Yeah. But this major land uses corroborates this story we see here that it seems like satellite imagery is telling us there's more of this perennial grassland than the census is. And I think that the area that looks like it's perennial grassland covers is actually perennial cover. I don't think it's error in the data. I think it's differences of who owns it, how it's used.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe that might have been a different conclusion 15 years ago, but now I think the methods are solid.
I'd love to see continuation of future directions on this study.
Oh, this is a fascinating landlands. I've known about it for a long time.
Okay, I think we're just about out of time. Any new questions? No? Okay, with that, thank you. Ms.
Oh, you're
Murphy.
welcome.
That time, you've already been on campus for at least a semester and a half.
I'm gonna use this paper in my class this year. I'm teaching regenerative grazing. And I'm gonna also teach multi-species grazing, so
Oh, excellent.
I use this paper as a motivator to
I was surprised, honestly, at the